Hello and good evening, everybody. Welcome to our evening with Clapham Bookfest. I'm Lucy Kane from Time and Leisure magazine, and we're very delighted to be hosting this evening and also to be media partners for Clapham Bookfest. It's such an excellent event. So this evening we have Clapham author Julie Anderson in conversation with author Elizabeth Buchan, and so we're very much looking forward to an excellent chat and finding out more about her latest book. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Julie.
Thanks, Lucy. Right, well, my name's Julie Anderson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a trustee of the Clapham Book Festival, which is one of South London's annual celebrations of books and reading. Our festival showcase, the physical event, will, we hope, take place this year on the 16th of October. Date for your diaries. But with all the restrictions, we've had to be quite innovative. So this year we're going ahead, but we have some innovations by way of literary walks, because Clapham has a long and rich heritage in literature and writing, and also live streaming the events from Omnibus Theatre. So people can either attend in person or watch from the comfort of their own home. A further adaptation is a series of Zoom events, of which this is the first, with Time and Leisure, who are our media partners, live discussions with authors who have a connection with Clapham or South London. And before we begin, thank you, I have to say, to Lucy and to all the people at Time and Leisure for hosting this and for all their support. You can read about the festival and much else, obviously, in the magazine, online on the Time and Leisure website, and also in the Weekender newsletter. However, without further ado, we'll move on to talk to our first author, who is Elizabeth Buchan. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hello.
Hi. Now, Elizabeth's a long-time resident of Clapham, whose latest book, Two Women in Rome, was published in June by Corvus Books. It's already climbing the bestseller lists. I believe it was number 2 on Kindle at one stage. Lucy, is that right?
A Glorious Dawn.
Yeah. Excellent. Now, Elizabeth has spent much of her life working in the world of books and writing. So I'd like to start by asking her how that all started.
Just say before I answer that, thank you so much, Time and Leisure and Lucy, for inviting me to help debut this very exciting and innovative sort of new stage for the Clapham Book Festival. It's really fabulous. Yes, so how did it all start? Well, I suppose it was because I was so awful at being a child. I was really sort of large and awkward and very shy, so I spent most of my time reading under the bed covers with the illicit torch. I was even worse at being an adolescent and was the sort of girl that ended up dancing with a chair when the school held a dance and the local boys' school was invited in, and I wasn't chosen by any of them. So reading was a recourse, reading was a nourishment. And I think I must have, around about those years, those early adolescent years, conceived the idea of becoming a writer, which seemed enormously ambitious. And but because I felt instinctively that one needed a bit more experience before putting pen to paper, so I decided that it would be better to be the cat looking at the king and try and join publishing. And I was lucky enough to get a job at Penguin Books, where I was employed as a blurb writer. And it was an amazing job. They paid me to put my feet up on the desk and to read through the treasure trove of Penguin Books at the time. Well, it's still the orange titles, the blue titles, the Pelicans, the Penguin specials, the cookery list, the poetry, you name it. It was all there in this wonderful, wonderful treasure house that was Penguin Books. And it had a terrible effect on my family life, because I became the Penguin bore, because I could tell you at the drop of a hat about the new science of strong materials, or Japanese basket work in Japan, or what Bernard Shaw had said about female socialism. Blurb writers, by and large, are a despised breed, and they tend to get it in the neck from both editors and marketeers and the salespeople. So I was always advising the people who I subsequently employed, because I took over running the office quite soon after joining, to buy a box of tissues and to develop the thick skin, which I think is very, very good training to be the writer, because you need to weep as the writer, but you need to be able to carry on despite things going wrong, or despite criticism. Just one thing. Blurb writers were the pond life in publishing hierarchy, but we weren't absolutely supine. And at one point in Penguin, and you mustn't take this too seriously, we took our revenge, and the wonderful Sarah Harrison, who was a very well-known author at that point, well, still is, had put together a list of adjectives which you could employ, which meant exactly the opposite. So if we said something was thoughtful, we meant it was tedious. And if it was epic, we thought the editor had been cowed by the author. And if it was provocative, it was irritating. And if it was enchanting, it generally had a dog in it. And heartwarming, it had a dog and a child. And if it was heart-wrenching, they both died. But you mustn't take that too seriously. But that was our way of our little prodding at the system. So when I had children and was still enmeshed in bringing them up, there was no time to think about writing. But when they became 5 and 8, around about that time, I thought, well, I'm never going to have any more time ever to think or to do the things I thought I would do before I settled down to writing. I might as well get on with it. And so I turned to my husband and I said, look, I'm going to have a go. He was I'd give up my job in publishing. He was extremely noble. He went very, very pale, actually. And he said, well, okay, you must have your chance, but I just want you to know that I'll still be thinner than you if we starve, which was true. So I'm embarked on this journey, and it's an inner and outer journey. It's both one that's taken me physically all over the world, and I've been very, very lucky with that. Seeing places and talking to people, writers, readers, thinking about them. But it's also pushed me on a journey, the inner journey, which is to embark on a landscape which you have no knowledge of, without a map and with no compass. And it's a question of being willing, I found, to re-educate myself. And so I left Penguin and the blurb writing with the treasure house of the memories of the treasure house of Penguin under my belt, ready to put pen to paper. And that's how it all began, Julie.
I will never read a blurb on the back of a book in the same way again, I have to say. that was wonderful. It's interesting that you decided that you'd start from the bottom, as it were, and it must give you a very interesting perspective on publishing in general, as well as writing. I think you're probably quite fearsome when it comes to speaking with your editors and their fellow publishing workers. But anyway, tell us about your latest book, the Two Women in Rome, which I have a copy of. Here we go. I've been well prepared.
Oh, thank you.
There we go. I have if you can see it, Two Women in Rome, which came out in June and is published by Corvus. Would you like to tell us a bit about that?
Well, Two Women in Rome has a dual timeline which links two women separated by 30 years, who never meet. But they do have the common experience of living in Rome. And the one who lived there earlier in the 70s, Nina Lawrence, worked as a landscape gardener. During a period in Rome in particular, but all over Italy as well, which came to be known as the Years of Lead, which was a period of really quite toxic civil unrest and strife, when there was a war going on between the Christian Democrats, who are one political flank, and the communists, who are another political flank. And there were all sorts of residues and conspiracies and bombings and shootings. That's why it was known as the Years of Lead, because so much lead was expended. And political strife led to violence and assassination, and political assassination. And while Nina was there, the ex-prime minister, Aldo Moro, was kidnapped and subsequently found dead in the back of a Renault van. But so she's there observing it, and she's thinking about it, and she's writing about it. But is she all that she seems? Are there other things going on in her life? And 30 years later, Lottie Archer, an archivist, has taken up her post in the archive devoted to expatriate papers. And there are plenty in Rome. Rome is an absolute magnet for certainly the British, and there are plenty of papers to be working on. When she comes across the trove of Nina's papers, and concealed in it is a painting of an Annunciation, which might possibly be medieval. At first glance, it's very difficult to tell. So what has happened to Nina? Because the papers reveal that she died young, and she had a very pitiful funeral in the Protestant cemetery with only a Roman Catholic priest there and a member from the British, a junior member from the British consul. And Lottie becomes, because she's making her transition herself, she's settling in Rome, she's got a new marriage, she's given up her very good job back in England as a chief archivist in order to pursue this marriage and to start a new life. She becomes, as in the interregnum, as she's settling down, very, very absorbed by Nina's story and begins to follow it and to find out what happens. It's about politics, yes, a little bit, and it's about work and how crucial they are to her life, but it's also about how you shape your sensibility, because when you experience new locations, and how you make your way through things that are very difficult and new and strange and sometimes very bewildering. And it's about forgiveness, and it's about loyalty.
And I think you have experience of living in Rome yourself, don't you?
I visited it on several occasions. I mean, my first occasion was when I was a child of about 8, I suppose. And my parents were living in Nigeria, and I hadn't seen them for a year. And this was the first time I was being flown out to see them. And my grandmother, who I was extremely fond of, but not at that particular moment, made me dress in very short shorts on the assumption that I'd be landing in the tropics, which was perfectly practical. But actually it was midwinter here and freezing. And so it was in Rome where we landed, and I was made to walk across the tarmac in my shorts into the terminal, thinking I was going to die of humiliation and cold. And then I walked into the terminal, and the most extraordinary thing happened. I thought I walked into Dante's paradise, because it was warm. It was full of the most extraordinary scents and sounds, language, perfume, food, a swirling mass of colour. It was quite extraordinary, and it hit me with a complete sort of, it was like being slapped in the face, only much more pleasant. And I circled around, and this is a story that will make people shudder, and it would certainly have made me shudder if it had been my own daughter. This very lovely elderly gentleman, beautifully dressed, spoke Italian, spoke impeccable English, and he said to me, "Was I hungry?" And I said, "Well, I was actually." And he said, "Right." And he took me off to the cafeteria and he gave me my first plate of spaghetti bolognese. And I thought, I am in heaven. It was robust, delicious, sustaining, nourishing. And then he led me back to the plane, which was about to take off again. And that actually summoned up for me what Rome became. On the subsequent visits, which I've never lived there, sadly, but I did go to stay there with my godmother, who was living there, and she had access to various places that the public weren't allowed to at that point. And one of the ones that struck me in particular was the catacombs, where the early Christians had holed up, and they'd painted on the walls. And I'll never forget my first glimpse of them, because they depicted a Christ who was extraordinarily happy and convivial. He was there wining and dining and harvesting, and nothing like the sort of tortured Gothic figure that he became in later epochs, when a different view was taken about his doctrines and his way in the world. But before, obviously at the beginning, he was this very convivial figure. And that struck me as completely wonderful, and I've never forgotten that. And then I put that together with another experience when I was staying there with my godmother, and she took me to see, in one of those papal sort of meetings in St. Peter's, where there were hundreds of thousands of people, and the Pope is borne in on the palanquin, and you're there with a veil over your head and all the rest of it. And I've never forgotten one little detail, quite apart from the roar of excitement and sort of veneration when the then Pope was then brought in, was that very often the women had tiny little glass vials, and when they saw the Pope, some of them began to cry, and they collected their tears in the vials because they wanted to preserve that moment. So over those visits, it became clear to me that Rome was a city which was multi-layered. It was rather like a fabulous patisserie. It was full of various layers of history. It had a style and an elegance, a kindness, robustness, also the underside, the dark underside of those difficult political years. It's violence, if you looked for it, it's poverty, as well as its extraordinary glittering set pieces. And so it became something in my mind that I knew that I wanted to write about in the end. And there go my two girls to go and experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it sounds like you were utterly entranced by it, I have to say.
I was, yes.
But it's a very entrancing place, I think, to anyone who knows it. But I'm going to take you slightly off to one side here and say, well, Two Women in Rome obviously has two women in the title, and it's about your two girls, as you put it. But all your books have women central characters. Why do you write almost exclusively from a female point of view?
Lots of reasons, I think. The female experience does interest me, and I think it is interesting. And over the years, it's not necessarily been very well represented in political and social life. So this is the one arena where females can, if you like, set out their shop. A lot of men have written about a lot of men, and this is the rebalancing, I think. It's a tricky question. I'm not sure that I wouldn't write from a male point of view, but I'm certainly attracted to the female experience, and I'm very interested in how it unravels, I think, is the short answer to that one, Julie.
Because, I mean, a lot has changed in terms of women's experience in the last, say, 50 years. And I know that there was a period when you were writing, I think you were writing for Penguin at the time, when you based your books in contemporary London and the home counties, and it was very much about the female experience at that time, at the end of the 20th and the start of the 21st century. And I wondered whether that was a sort of active attempt to capture the changes taking place in women's lives at that time.
Yes, but there was also the broader point. Yes, things were changing. I mean, when I went to university, I wanted a bank account, and my father had to sign the papers in order for me to have a bank account. Well, that clearly has gone. Those days have gone. And now women can be running, big companies. So that has happened. But also, I myself was enmeshed in the domestic arena. So I was thinking about it and living it. And so the stuff of the material was there. I very much agreed with Virginia Woolf, who said the stuff of fiction is in the kitchen and the ticking of the clock. And there was a slightly sort of political point I think I was making, that the important and profound changes in sensibility and how we think and the milestones we make can be achieved and made and experienced in the domestic arena when you're peeling the potatoes or doing the wretched ironing, in as profound and meaningful a way as they can be when you're riding to battle, say, if you're writing about history, or in the political arena. So I felt that this was a redress of how we set and look at the importance of various changes and thoughts and behaviors in our lives, in particular the female one. Yeah.
Interesting. I want to ask you, do you think that there is such a thing as the female sensibility?
It's a tough one, Julie.
Sorry.
Well, yes and no. I think increasingly probably there is emerging. I think there's a practical point to be made there. We're told that women read the majority of fiction which is out there, which may or may not be true. We never know how precise these figures are. But I do know that if you allow men, or give them a signal, perhaps, that this book may be something that may appeal to them, then the take-up by male readership of particular books does increase. And I was just a tiny case in point. I wrote about the special operations executive for my second book, about an undercover agent going into France during the Second World War, and there was a Lysander aircraft on the jacket. And I've never received so many letters from men in all my life, including one from an ex-special agent who took me off to the Special Forces Club and gave me lunch and wanted to know all about the details and how much he enjoyed it, and was I going to write more? So I think if you allow men, by giving them a signal, perhaps, when they're sort of wandering around these areas which they think are traditionally female, to read about, there can be a change. But I do think that this sort of divide between men and women and their habits is beginning to blur for all sorts of reasons. I won't go into the politics of that now, but it is changing.
Yes, I will. Yeah, absolutely. Right, well, you touched there on some of the work that you've done, some of the books that you'd written set in the past, and in that instance on the SOE. But in your more recent novels, as well as your early ones, you do seem to be drawn to periods of upheaval and drama. So, I mean, your early ones, you set a book there was a book in revolutionary France, there was one in Nazi-occupied France, and then more recently, you set books in World War II Denmark, in 1970s Italy, obviously the most recent one, but also with Museum of Open Promises in Cold War Czechoslovakia. Are you particularly drawn, do you think, to periods of conflict and repression?
Well, I think I must be, actually. Now you know all that, Julie. I hadn't thought about it. Having moved on from the domestic arena and being unenmeshed by it because the children have left, it does free up the mind, or freed up my mind. I can't speak for any other writers who might be listening. And yes, conflict and repression and the politics are extremely important because there is a lot of it around. And if the novelist is to try and make sense of how people pilot themselves through the world, which is hopefully what I'm trying to do, they've got to look at those areas. You don't have to make it the central plank or the mainstay necessarily, but you have to know about it. And also there is the wider point to be made that, you know, the conflict and repression and problems and terrible things that happen are also a metaphor for what happened in personal lives. I mean, we're very busy as a society making rules for ourselves and trying to live our lives in families, perhaps, or extended families, or whatever we choose. And there are many paths these days, thank goodness. We do come across conflict and repression, and putting your characters within ourselves and with the people we meet and how we conduct ourselves with them and in our workplaces. And the conflict and repression of the wider landscape and tapestry, to use that overworked word, it can reflect very nicely on a novel if you're creating something around that kind of topic. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that interests me about some of your more recent books is that you do explore the past, but you do it through objects, which I find quite interesting. I mean, long before Neil Ferguson and his History of the World in 101 Objects.
Thank you.
I mean, because you have, I mean, in Museum of Broken Promises, you have a book about a museum, a collection of objects which are in the museum, not because they have not to prompt a story, but they are there because they have a story attached. They exhibit a broken promise of some kind, which is a neat sort of bit of meta text in a book which is about a woman who's revisiting her own past and her own story. So I thought that was rather clever. And you do it again, of course, in the more recent one, when you've got that 15th century painting, the object that prompts or helps to prompt Lottie's interest in Nina, who died 3 decades before. I mean, do you see objects as the center of your stories? Do they?
And they can do different things. I mean, they do different things in Museum of Broken Promises, which is a place which you bring an object which symbolizes the promise that has been broken either by yourself, you the donor, or by someone to you. And I was thinking about how these days we really have managed in a lot of contemporary life to peel away ritual, which is something that we really need in some ways. So I wanted to make the bringing of an object that represents a broken promise to a museum and saying why, and seeing it displayed as part of a ritual to try and make a healing process or a statement. So it could be, you know, something to do with family betrayal or political betrayal or a friend's betrayal. There's an adopted son who gives a railway ticket there because his birth mother, who he had tried to find, failed to turn up when he sent her the ticket to meet him, and he finds that almost unbearable. A bridegroom donates a veil because his bride betrayed him almost from the first day of the wedding, and a child donates their milk tooth because the father has left home before the tooth fairy can come. And those are there for them to look at and for other people to look at, to try and help achieve some kind of healing and synthesis with it. Whereas with the painting in Two Women in Rome, that is there really to lead you into a sort of discovery of the iconography of the past, because the past is so important, but very often we don't really think about trying to understand it, or I don't. You look at it and you make sort of blithe assumptions or hasty assumptions. So I thought if you had a painting into which you could begin to decode what gestures make, what certain positioning of figures make, how the colours are used and what the colours symbolised, it would begin to make Lottie, the person who's looking at it, the archivist, make her journey into a past, and thereby able to interpret it more efficiently. She can't interpret it absolutely or entirely, but she can edge closer to a truth that was there when it was painted. So the objects are totemic in one sense, but they do different things in another, Julie. Yeah.
Well, here's a question that's close to my heart anyway. There is a mystery at the heart of many of your books. Certainly in the new Mrs. Clifton, when the prologue is set in 1974 in a house in Clapham, where new occupants discover, well, make a very gruesome discovery in their back garden, even though much of the book is set in 1945. And in Museum, we have the mystery right at the beginning, when we're with a young woman waiting on an Austrian railway platform for a man who never comes. So there's a mystery there. And it's clear that you like writing mysteries, even though you wouldn't, your books are not found on the mystery shelves. Do you think that mysteries are in fact at the heart of your storytelling, or indeed of all storytelling?
Oh, I think it's all storytelling, isn't it? Because if you're writing fiction in particular, and I'm not excluding non-fiction actually, because biography is an attempt at the same thing, to unravel a life. We are trying to unravel the mysteries of human spirit, of human behavior, and of the things that impel them. And as you know, Julie, being a terrific crime writer, thriller writer, you could narrow that down in the thriller and the crime novel to a more precise focus. But I think the same thing is still going on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the crime thriller has that genre has its own set of conventions which are different. But yes.
Yeah, and a point is that as you read a novel, whether or not it's technically a crime thriller or a mystery or a ghost story, or just a much more conventional story, say, you do still have to embed in it the coiled spring, which sort of keeps the reader engaged with the action, the inner action, its backbone as it's unraveling. So towards the end, this springs unravels completely. So you are presented with the whole universe of the story, and you understand it, and you think, yes, I have arrived. And I didn't necessarily know what was going to happen, or I didn't know how I was going to feel if you did know what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And that's the art of writing, I think, to try and keep that sort of essential existential mystery, if you like, within the novel that you're writing, and to build in the devices and techniques which the reader will be hooked by. And that's quite a challenge.
It certainly is. Right. Well, we're actually we're coming to the end of our time, I fear. But I've got a couple more questions for you. And going back to Mrs. Clifton, which is set in Clapham post World War II, I mean, it's very, very evocative of the place, the physical place of Clapham, but also of the time in terms of that immediate post-war period with rationing and regulation, the greyness, the exhaustion, and so on. And it clearly you've lived in Clapham a long time, so it's your immediate environment. But so I wanted to ask how important the place was to you as a writer.
I think it's extremely important, actually, Julie, and I think the longer you live somewhere like Clapham, which I've been lucky enough to live a long time, as you say, the more important it becomes, and the more you see, and the more you understand, and the more you want to know. Yes, it is hugely important. And the discoveries I made with the new Mrs. Clifton were astonishing. I mean, in Germany, it was quite obvious that things were in complete decay. The populations had gone feral. There wasn't an aspirin or an alarm clock to be had. There were huge migrations. It was what the Germans called the 0 hour. And you could understand why that was happening. But it was quite interesting to discover how chaotic London was, and Clapham in particular, in 1945, when psychic disruption of being at war was manifested in the way that people behaved, how they felt. They're restless and they're unsettled and they're quite rude. And I know this goes against the myths of how we kept our chins up and carried on. It wasn't quite like that if you look at all the documents. And you were greedy for food and drink and colour and a normal life. And lots of people kept saying to each other, we just want to be normal. And the other thing that was very discombobulating is buildings had changed and the typography had changed within 4 years. The bombing had altered streets and houses and terraces. And you just have to look around where I'm sitting now and you can see where the infill went on after the war. And hot water is a luxury and shampoo is rationed and soap is still rationed. And if you wanted a new basin because your old one had been bombed, you had to go on a waiting list, and you forget asking for avocado, you just took what colour there was. So yes, and the discovery that was the Clapham of 1945, as opposed to the wonderful, very vibrant, very prosperous place in many respects Clapham is now, was very interesting. And I think that sense of place pulls me as the novelist into looking deeper, and yes, very important.
And even more important now, perhaps, when we're living during a pandemic and so many of us can't get to places that we know and love.
Yes.
And to an extent, we're all escaping into books or in other ways.
Yes. And I think that's been, if there is a positive for the pandemic, and I'm not sure there is, people have been reading and thinking about books, and having the time to do so. And when you look back a year and a half ago, when you think of the pace of life then, or certainly I look back on mine, and how over this year and a half, even with the other things that were happening, the ability to read and to rethink how you read has been absolutely lovely, including your books, Julie.
You're being very complimentary. That's very kind. But I'm aware that other people might want to ask questions of you as well as me. So I'm going to ask my last question before giving others the chance to ask theirs. And this is from someone who's relatively new to writing herself, to someone who's been writing for many years now. And my question is, does it get any easier?
Do you want the truth?
Yes.
No.
No.
I think it's just as hard as it ever was. The one thing you do have, Julie, is more technical tools at your disposal. You know how to do things quicker and easier and more efficiently. You know, for example, a very simple precept does work, like less is more. You know that research can overpower you and you can become so enchanted with your own research that you think, if I know everything about the French Revolution, you, the reader, has to know everything about the French Revolution. And I did that in my first book, Daughters of the Storm. And if any of you would like to know the colour of the kitchen chairs in Danton's kitchen, I can direct you to page 19. I thought it was fascinating, but it's not necessary. The whole point about research is managing it, synthesizing it, controlling it. And those kind of techniques and educational ways of learning of writing do make it easier. But actually sitting down every day and producing your 90 to 100,000 words does not get any easier. Nor does, in my case, I find finding the plot. I do find that still very, very difficult.
My publishers tell me I have trouble with plot too, but my books are very different to yours. Right, well, on that note, I'll conclude this part of the discussion, but just to say thank you very much. That's been very, very interesting. And when is the paperback of Two Women out? Because it's out on ebook now and it's out in hardback, but not in paperback.
I think it's out in June 22.
Right, okay. Well, before I hand over back to Lucy to field all the questions from you, I'd just like to quickly take the opportunity to mention that there will be other Zoom discussions coming up from Time and Leisure and Clapham Bookfest, and we'll be speaking about books and writers with a Clapham or South London connection during the run up to the festival in October. But do keep your eye on the websites, either the Clapham Bookfest one or the Time and Leisure one, and on social media to see what's coming up in the near future. But I'll hand you back to Lucy for now.
Thank you, Julie and Elizabeth. That was so fascinating. There was it was such a wonderful insight into your world as an author, and I'm lucky enough to be going on holiday next week, so I am absolutely going to be taking your book with me, because I think
Lucy, that's lovely.
Fascinating, and it's just like the perfect thing to take away. So I can't wait to read it. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to just quickly put everybody onto gallery so I can see if anybody puts their hand up if you'd like to ask a question. Now you can do it either just by raising your hand or putting up a yellow hand if somebody else is asking a question. I haven't got yes, we've got Jago Pointer. If you'd like to ask your question, just take yourself off mute.
Sorry, yes, I'm Paula. I'll just say that.
I thought you might be, but
I just wondered, when you are writing and really in the midst of the creation, can you read anything else or anything, I mean, another book as opposed to a newspaper or whatever it is? I mean, are you tunnel visioned in that way once the creative part is on you?
Yes and no. I can read non-fiction, because maybe it's probably to do with the research, but I find to read somebody else's novel just at that particular point, which is towards the end of the process of writing, I find that can be very distracting and also rather subduing making, because they very often are extremely good writers and you think, oh help, I can't match that. But it can be quite invasive if you're reading other people's fiction at that moment. That's not to say you don't fall upon them the minute you've finished and think, glorious, I've got glorious time now to read them. Non-fiction, much easier to read while you're writing. Yeah.
Thank you. Have we got any other questions coming up at the moment? Yes, we have got, I'm sorry, I can't quite see it. Alice. No, you're still on mute, Alice.
Has that done it?
Yes. We can hear you.
I'm a writer who's very architectural, and so the new Mrs. Clifton, I was quite fascinated at the amalgam of houses, as I assume, which I thought worked very well. And I thought, well, perhaps she's particularly inspired by the houses on Clapham Common West Side. And I just wonder if you could say a word about that.
Actually, it wasn't West Side so much as South Side. And I managed to get an extraordinary volume that was published by the various councils in London after the war, which showed maps of the streets, area by area, and each one had coloured in the houses or terraces that had been bombed. It told you what the bomb was it a V1 or a V2 that fell on them, whether the house was slightly destroyed or totally destroyed. And I looked at the one for the area of Clapham Common South Side, and I saw various terraces had gone, and so I then transposed from there.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Elizabeth, I would like to ask, do you have any advice for any want-to-be writers who have their novel sitting on their hard drive and they just can't get around to finishing the edit and sending it off? And just asking for a friend.
Right, well, please tell your friend that by having it sitting on the hard drive is half the battle. I think it's a question of knowing yourself. When are you best at writing? Is it morning or evening? how much time do you have? Be very realistic about how much time, what I'm trying to say is, how much time do you have to spend on this project? Because you may be very busy with family and work and blah, 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 blah. Just identify a slot in the day where you can do it. Give yourself a realizable target, like 2 to 4 pages. They turn into 8 to 16 pages. Don't try and overdo it if you're very busy and beset by other things. But my key instruction would be, is do it. Do it religiously. Do it for half an hour every day. I mean, when I started out, I used to get up at very early before the children were awake, on that assumption that 2 pages would turn into 4. And it does work, I promise you. I promise your friend, it does work.
Thank you. Excellent advice. We've got a question coming in from Susanna, and then we'll come to Ruthie.
Hi, Elizabeth. My mum and I have enjoyed your books for years. It's great to see you tonight. I was wondering, I know you said that when you're writing, you have to stick to non-fiction. When you're able to read fiction, what kind of authors do you enjoy? Or who are your favourite authors?
Oh, gosh. Well, I had a run on Anne Tyler not so long ago. I think Ian McEwan, not all of his books, I don't like, some I like much more than others. I thought his Atonement was quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I've been recommended Sarah Winman's latest novel, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's set in Florence around the Second World War, and has a lot to do with art and various things like that, which sounds wonderful. And she is a very, very good writer. And Margaret Atwood, I don't respond to all of her stuff, but I think her Alias Grace, her Cat's Eye, novels like that are truly, truly superb, really. And I'm about to tackle some of the Booker Prize long lists that have come out. I thought The Sweetness of Water sounded rather interesting, set in the post-American Civil War, and I think that must have been a really, really fascinating subject to write about. So, and you have to be quite hard-edged to do it well, I think, too. So whatever comes over my desk, I'm very happy to have a look at. But if it's an Anne Tyler, I will fall on it first.
Yeah, thank you.
Super, thank you, Susanna. Ruthie, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, everybody. Lizzie, thank you, and Julie, thank you. Fascinating interview and discussion. As you know, I'm a great fan of your books, Lizzie, and they have changed over the years. I would be interested to know, is it your writing style that has changed, or is it your approach to a novel which has changed? Is there much editorial intervention rather, not invention? Freudian slip.
I think it's a series of things, Ruthie. I think I find as a writer, I tend to circle around subjects and arenas, like, the earlier ones were sort of much more sort of passion and politics set in the French Revolution and the SOE. And then I thought to myself, actually, I'm not really qualified to write about those until I know a bit more about things, until I know a bit more about writing. And then, as I say, I was enmeshed in the domestic life, and that seemed to me a very substantial and interesting and perhaps important arena to be writing about. And then I wanted to, you say, was there editorial intervention? I have to say, I wanted to splash out in my choice of subject a little bit after writing, I think it was a novel called Daughters, which was a sort of replay of Pride and Prejudice. And I wrote a book called The Book of Hours, which was about searching manuscripts that have been missing from books of hours and where they might be and how the search might reflect and refract the experience of the person who was searching for them. And my publisher said they didn't want to publish it. which was a real slap in the face. So I had to think again and sit down and write another domestic book, which is what they wanted, because that was the way I was being packaged at that point. And I don't blame them, because publishing is a tricky game. It is a business, like it or lump it, and it has to make its money and make its way. And if it had spent money and time making you one kind of author, it's very difficult for them to suddenly change tack. So I decided actually to leave them and go to another publisher, where I was able to do the things that I wanted to do, and wrote Museum of Broken Promises and Two Women in Rome. And I think that coincides with that journey I was talking about, the inner journey and the new landscapes and the new maps that you're encountering as the writer, and the preoccupations you find interest you, and the ways that you deal with it. And of course, when you're writing at my sort of age, when you write and look at different things will preoccupy you and become the subjects. And that was one of the reasons I wrote the book called Revenge of the Middle-Aged Woman, because I thought that a middle-aged person or woman would react differently to the kind of dissolution of her family that happened as someone 50-ish, then she would react very differently from someone who was 20 or 30. So I think as you grow and age, your preoccupations become different, and that I think to an extent, this is very long-winded, reflects on your writing style as well.
Well, I'm glad you followed your star, Lizzie, because I think, personally, I think you are so at home in delving into historical subjects and historical backgrounds, and congratulations.
Thank you, Ruthie.
Yeah.
Have we got any other questions that people would like to ask? If not, I'd like to find out if you think, Elizabeth, whether or not the pandemic will have any effect on your writing in terms of maybe if it would have any change, would it change it in any way, or would it affect the sort of story at all?
Well, I think it'll sharpen what probably all of us sort of think at the back of our minds, but it's brought it forward. And certainly as the writer, that life is precarious. We had got quite used to thinking that everything was sorted and the economy was well and health was well and political life was reasonable. But the pandemic has shown us that actually nature and this world is a precarious place to be in, and we really have to think about that, and how we approach it and how we manage it and how we manage ourselves. And I'll certainly have that in the back of the mind when I'm writing and choosing subject. Yeah.
Interesting, really interesting answer. Well, unless we've got any other questions, have we got any other hands up? It has been a wonderful discussion. It's been so fascinating, and thank you so much for your insight, Elizabeth, and wonderful questions from Julie. Great event to kickstart the Zoom events that we're hosting as Time and Leisure, and we're really, really proud to be media partners for such a brilliant Bookfest event. So thank you very much. It's lovely to see you all this evening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evenings. And I hope we'll see you on a future event. So
thank you, Lucy.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.